Hey, what's going on, guys? So I got a really cool project for you today. We're going to be building a full stack AI powered chat app called Chat AI. And I'm just going to give you a quick demo before I explain anything. So we just log in and you just have to put your name and email, and then we can go ahead and say something. We'll say like, we'll say who, we'll say who was the 10th president of the US. Okay, so it says AI is thinking, and we get back the 10th president of the US was John Tyler. Now, it's going to keep the context, so if I just say simply who was the 12th, it's going to know what I'm talking about. So the 12th president was Zachary Taylor. All right, and if I were to log out or leave the chat and then come back with the same email, my chat will be saved. All right, now to achieve this, we're going to be using Vue.js and Pinia for state management on the front end and Node.js and Express on the back end. And we're using TypeScript on both the front end and back end. Now, there's a bunch of technologies that we need to incorporate to achieve this. For the whole artificial intelligence aspect, we're using the OpenAI API, the completions API, using GPT-4. And then for the whole chat aspect, we're using Stream Chat at getstream.io. So Stream offers SDKs for powerful applications that implement real-time chat as well as video and audio. And this is just one of the many ways to use Stream Chat. So like I said, it's going to handle the whole messaging aspect, the users, the channels. Now, even though Stream does store your chat logs and stuff, we're going to set up our own database, our Postgres database with Neon. So Neon offers serverless Postgres databases that you can literally set up in like 10 seconds. And there's features like branching. It's extremely scalable. And we're going to set it up so that our project saves the users and the chats in the Neon database. And then we'll be using the Drizzle ORM to interact with the database, as well as create schemas, run migrations, and so on. And then at the very end, we're going to deploy. The backend is going to go to render, so render.com. And then the front end, the Vue application, will go to Vercel. All right, so this is just an all-in-one dev to deployment project. I have the repositories for both the front-end UI and the back-end API in the description. So I would suggest you follow along with me. I think that's the best way to learn. So let's jump into it. All right, so I just want to quickly go over some of the websites where you can find the documentation for different parts of this project. So first off, we have Stream Chat, which we'll be using for all the chat aspects, and you can find the docs at getstream.io if you go to developers, and we're using the chat messaging. There's also video and audio capabilities if you want to check that out. But if we go to chat messaging, there's all these platforms that we can choose from, and we're using it on the back end. So you want to choose the Node.js option. And then from here, you have all different topics like users, tokens, permissions, creating channels, and all that good stuff. So that's for Stream Chat. And then for Neon, which is our cloud Postgres database, you can go to neon.tech. And if you click on docs, same thing, you just have all your topics on the side here. And then Drizzle is the ORM that we're going to be using. That's so we can easily interact with our database, with our Neon Postgres database. And that's orm.drizzle.team. Click on docs or documentation, and you can find more info here. And then finally, we have OpenAI, which is at platform.openai.com. And this is what we're using for the whole AI aspect of it. And we are going to have to generate API keys for OpenAI, for Neon, and for Stream. So you might want to just keep these websites open. So let's go ahead and just open up a terminal and just navigate to wherever you want to create this project. And we're going to have two separate folders for the backend and front end. The backend will be Chat AI API, and the front end will be Chat AI UI. That'll be the Vue.js. Backend will be the Node and Express. So I'm going to put both in a parent folder. So let's create that. So I'm going to say make directory and Chat AI, and then cd into that Chat AI folder and make another directory called Chat AI -API, and that will be our back end. And I want to open that up in VS Code, so I'm going to say code and then Chat AI API. And of course, if you want to use a different text editor, that's absolutely fine. Okay, I'm going to be using my integrated terminal, so I'll go ahead and open that up, and we just want to run npm init. Of course, you need to have Node.js installed, and let's go through this. So package name, version, that's good. Description, let's say this is going to be a backend for, say, for an AI chat application. And then entry point, I'm going to call server, say server.js, and then author, you can put your own name if you want, and MIT for the license. So type, I'm going to be using ES modules, so we want to put module instead of common.js. I mean, if you want to use common.js, you can, but we'll be using import. All right, so now that we've done that, let's install our dependencies. And I just want to quickly go over what our backend dependencies are going to be. So we have Express, of course, which is our backend web framework. Cores, which allows access to resources from a different origin. That's because our front end and back end will be on different domains. .env allows us to use environment variables from a .env file. StreamChat is the official JavaScript client to work with StreamChat in Node.js or in JavaScript. And then OpenAI is the client to work with the OpenAI API. TypeScript we're going to be using on both the back end and front end. A little bit more to the setup in the back end, but it's not too bad. We're going to be using something called TSX to execute our TypeScript. Because even though with Node.js version, I think 23, TypeScript is supported, but all it really does is strip your types. It doesn't actually compile, it doesn't execute it. So that's where TSX comes in. If you want to use TS Node or something else, you can. And then Drizzle is the ORM to interact with our Postgres database, and then Drizzle Kit is a CLI for Drizzle. And we'll install the Drizzle stuff a little later. But let's install some of these dependencies now. So let's say npm install express. We want, what else? Cores. We want .env, stream chat, so stream-chat, and also OpenAI. I think that's all I want right now as far as regular dependencies. Now for dev dependencies, let's say npm install dash uppercase D, and we want TypeScript. And I'm also going to install TSX to execute the TypeScript. And then for types, we'll do types/node. Let's say at types/express, and also types/cores. Now, as far as our TypeScript config goes, we're going to create our TS config with npx and let's say tsc-init. And I'm going to open that up, and there's I have a configuration that I'm going to use. If you want to use the same one, you can just get it from the link in the description, the GitHub repo. But I'm going to paste this in, so it's pretty simple. I want to use ES modules and all that, all the latest features. So using node next for module and module resolution, and ES next for the target. Our output directory when we compile our TypeScript is going to be /dist. And then our root directory where we write our code is going to be /source. Okay, we're using strict mode or strict type checking, and then we're allowing importing common.js modules, we're allowing importing of JSON files as modules, and we're skipping the declaration files in the node modules folder to speed up compilation. So pretty simple setup. We'll go ahead and save that file. And then we want to create our scripts in package.json. So we want a dev script. And of course, with our dev script, we want to compile our TypeScript. So we're going to use TSC, so the TypeScript compiler, and then we're going to add --no emit because we don't actually want to produce JavaScript files when we run this. We're just running our dev server, and we just want to compile our TypeScript. And we also need to run TSX as well, and we're going to run that in watch mode. Okay, so no need for like node mon or anything like that. And then that's going to be source, and then server.ts will be the entry point, so that's what we want to run. Okay, and then to build our project out, to just compile, we want to run just TSC. And then the start script, so to run in production, is just going to be node, and then it'll be in a dist folder, and it'll be called server.js. So that's all we need for for our NPM scripts. All right, so now let's create a folder in the root called source. That's where we'll write all of our code. And let's create our entry point, which is going to be server.ts. I mean, if you don't want to use TypeScript, that's fine. We're not doing too much as far as TypeScript goes, so even if you're not familiar with it, you should be all right. Honestly, though, it's really becoming the standard. So, I mean, you're going to be creating TS files and TSX files all the time. So, I mean, I would suggest learning the basics of TypeScript if you don't know it. So, let's just create a basic Express server. So, we want to import Express from Express, and we want to import, let's see, we want to import cores as well. And we also want to import .env. And then we want to call .env.config. And then we'll initialize our Express app. So set that to Express. Okay, we have some middleware to add. So cores requires us to add an app.use. And we're also going to do app.use express.json because we want to be able to when we send a request, we want to be able to send JSON in the body. We also want to be able to send form data. So let's also do app.use and say express and then URL encoded and then just pass in an object with extended and set that to false. All right, and then we want to create our port variable, and I'm going to set the port in the .env, so I'll say process.env.port, or then use 5000. And then let's just take our app and let's listen on that port. Whoops. Listen on port, and then when that happens, we'll just run a console.log and put in some backticks here, and we'll say the server running on, and then output that port variable. All right, so let's create our .env. So that's going to go in the root, not in the source folder. And from here, we'll say port. And for now, I'm just going to set it to 8000 because I want to make sure that it's actually reading this value. So down at the bottom here, the terminal, or wherever your terminal is, let's run npm run dev. Okay, so server running on 8000, and it'll compile any TypeScript we have. Obviously, we don't have any right now. And before we start to add our route, I just want to make my first commit. So I'm going to open up a new terminal here, and let's run git init, and then we'll create our .gitignore, because you definitely don't want to push that .env. So let's add node modules and .env. All right, so we'll say git add all, git commit. What's this? Don't care. Git commit, and we'll just say initial express setup, or initial express and TS setup. All right, so now what we want to do is make our first route, and what this is going to do is it's going to reach out to Stream Chat, and it's going to register a user with Stream, okay? Because you can actually log into your Stream dashboard, and you can see the users that were registered for. What is this doing here? For your application. And when I say register, it's not traditional authentication where you're going to have a password and stuff. Basically, you come to the app and you put in your name and email, and then from there you get sent to the form to interact with the AI. So let's start by just creating a route. Now, since we're using TypeScript, we're also going to bring in from Express. We want to bring in request and response, uppercase R. And let's create our first route. We'll go down here. Let's say, I'll put a comment. Let's say register user with Stream Chat. And it's going to be a post request, so app post. And for the endpoint, we'll call this, excuse me, we'll say /register-user. And then we're going to have an async function here. Okay, and then as far as what this returns will be a promise and we're just going to add any to this, and then it's going to take in the request and response, and we want to set those to those types. So request and then res, which will be response. And then just to test it, I'll do a res.send, and we'll just say test. Okay, so now we have our first endpoint. Now, as far as how you test your endpoints, it's really up to you. I like to use Postman, and I have the Postman extension for VS Code. So if I click on this icon right here, I can make a new HTTP request, and it just opens up in a new tab, which is nice. So I'm going to make a post request to HTTP, and we want localhost, and I have it running on 8,000, and we want to do register-user. And you'll see I get a 200 response and I get test. So we know that route is working. We also want to send a name and email, so why don't we do a little bit of validation here. We'll say if, well, first of all, let's get the name and email. So that'll be in the request body. So let's say const, and then we'll destructure the name and email from request.body. And then we'll say if not name or not email, then we want to send back an error. So we'll return res dot, and let's do a status of 400, which is a user error. And then we'll attach the JSON. So just put an error here, and we'll say name and email are required. And then after the if, I'll just do a res.status, say 200, and JSON message success. All right, so let's try that out. So if I just send as is, I get the error. But if I send a name and email in the body, I can either do JSON data or I can use the form URL encoded. So I'm just going to add name and email, and then send, and I get success. All right, so now we want to start to work with Stream. We installed you should have the Stream client. So if you just look in your dependencies, you should have Stream Chat. That's what we're going to use. Now, in order to create an instance, we need our API key. So we're going to have to go to the getstream.io, and you can log in with either GitHub or Google. So I'm already logged in. I'm going to go to my dashboard. And you don't have to pay anything or enter any credit card info for this. We want to create a new app, and this has to be unique. So I'm just going to say we'll say chat AI, and I'll just do -Brad. You could put your own name, whatever. It has to be unique. And then just choose the locations for the chat and video storage and feed storage that's closest to you, and click Create App. And then you'll have your keys right here. We have a key and a secret. We need both of these. So I'm going to copy the key. I'm going to go into my .env, and we're going to add stream_API key and set that to the key. And then we also want the Stream API secret, which we can get from right here. I'm just going to copy that. Okay, so I'll paste that in. Now that we have that, we should be able to create an instance. So let's bring in the library, so import, or the client, and that's called Stream Chat. And then we're going to create it or initialize it right above our route. Let's say initialize the stream chat or stream client. So we'll say const, we'll call this chat client, and I'm going to set that to the stream chat. So stream chat dot, and then it's get instance. And then that's going to take in your API key and your API secret. So let's say process.env dot, and then stream API key. And I'm going to put a bang on the end of this, which is a non-null assertion. So I'm basically telling TypeScript that it's not going to be null or undefined. It's definitely there. And then we'll do the same with the secret. That gets passed in as well. Okay, so now we should have our chat client initialized. Now we can use it in our route. And the first thing I want to do is create an ID, because when you create a user, it needs to have a unique ID. And it's up to you on what you want that ID to be. I mean, you could install a package like UUID, but what I want to do is take the email. You don't have to type this out, but let's say that the email is brad@gmail.com. Then I want the ID to be brad_gmail_com. So that way we have a unique ID, but it's also readable, it's understandable. All right, so let's do that. So I actually want to, after we do the if here, let's wrap this in a try catch, and I'll move this success. I'm going to move that into the try, and then let's copy it, and then in the catch, if something goes wrong, then I'm going to send a 500 error. So let's change the status to 500. And for the message, we'll just say, or it's actually going to be error. So error, we'll say internal server error. All right, now in the try, let's generate the ID. So we want to say user ID, and we have access to the email that they enter. So we're going to use replace, and replace it'll take in what we want to replace and what we want to replace it with. So, and we pass in a regular expression. I know a lot of you guys, and including myself, hate regular expressions, but this is pretty simple. So in brackets, we're going to use the caret. So basically, we're saying if it doesn't match whatever I type here, which is going to be a lowercase a to z, so a lowercase letter, or an uppercase a to z, or 0 to 9, or an underscore or a dash. If it's anything other than that, I want to replace it with an underscore. And I want it to be global, so I'm going to put /g. So the second argument you pass in is what you want to replace it with, which in our case is going to be an underscore. Okay, so that'll generate the user ID. In fact, we can go ahead and do a console log of user ID just to check. And then if I make a request again with this brad@gmail and I send, if we look down in the console, brad_gmail_com. And again, if you want to do something different for IDs, you can. So yeah, let's get rid of the console log. And now I want to check to see if the user exists in stream chat. So let's say check if user exists, and we can do that. Let's put this in user response. And this is asynchronous, so we want to do await and then chat client, and then there's a method called query users. So we want to use that, and then what we can do is pass in an object where we want to match the ID, and we set that to an object with this money sign EQ, so we're saying if it equals the user ID. And we can do a console log of that as well. And then just go ahead and send. And if we look down here, you see it gives us an object with a duration and the users array, which is empty because that the user doesn't exist. That, in my case, it would be the Brad gmail.com doesn't exist. So what we can do after that, after we check if the user exists, or after we set that variable, we'll say if not user response.users.length. So we're saying if that array is empty, then we want to add new user to stream. So we can do that with the, there's a few different methods we can use. I'm going to use upsert user, which will create or update a user. So let's say chat client dot upsert. We want to do, it's just a single user, so upsert user. And then we're going to pass in an object. I'm going to assign the ID to the user ID, which will be that formatted email. The name, set that to name, and the email. And then I'm also going to add the role of user, because there's different roles. There's an admin user as well. In fact, if we look at the docs here, if I search for role, Permissions, let's see. Yeah, so right here, built-in roles. So user is a default user role. You have guest. You have admin, which is a role for users that can perform administrative tasks with elevated permissions. So we just want a regular user. Now, I should also mention that this is where you can also generate a token. So let's see. We could call right here create token. However, we're using this on the server side with an API key, so we don't need to do this. But if you were using this from React or Vue or some kind of front end, then you would want to create a token and you'd want to save that and then send that with your the rest of your requests. So, but we don't have to do that. So yeah, I just want to return now, basically just return the user ID, the name, and the email. So let's go right under that if. Actually, we already have this. We might as well just use that. Yeah, we'll get rid of the message and let's send the user ID, the name, and email. And I think that should do it. So we can try it out now. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to register the user brad@gmail.com. Let's click send. And I get back a 200. I get back, that's my user ID formatted from my email, my name, and the actual email. Now you should be able to actually log into your dashboard. So if I go to my Chat AI app here, and under chat messaging, if I go to Explorer, you can see I have my Chat AI Brad app, has an app ID, app name. If I click users, I got Brad90. Not sure where that came from. But right here is the user that I just created. And it has all these fields. It has the ID, the name, language, role, created at, updated at, if the user's banned, if they're online, if they're invisible. So lots of information. And you can delete users too. In fact, I'll delete that Brad90 user. Oh, it's an original dashboard user. Okay, so I can't delete that. All right, so we're able to register users now for the chat. And later on, we're also going to implement our Neon Postgres database so that it saves users there as well. And it also saves all the chats, all the logs. But before we do that, let's create our chat route so that we can send a question or whatever it is we want to send to the AI and use the OpenAI API to respond to that. So let's first of all bring in the OpenAI client. So up at the top here, we'll say import, and it's going to be OpenAI from OpenAI. And then we need to initialize OpenAI here as well, just like we did with Stream. So right here, I'll say initialize OpenAI. Now we are going to need an API key, so why don't we do that real quick? I'm going to jump over to platform.openai.com and log in. So from here, if we click on settings, go to API keys, you should see them here. I'll just create a new one. Let's say chat. And for project, I'll just use project 1. Okay, so I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to go ahead and add that to my .env. So here, let's say open_AI. Actually, no, let's do OpenAI underscore and then API underscore key, and then set that. Okay, so now what we can do is initialize here, let's say const OpenAI, excuse me, OpenAI, set that to new uppercase O OpenAI, and then pass in our API key, which is going to be process.env.OpenAI underscore API key. Okay, so that'll initialize that. Now, let's create our chat route. So I'm going to go under the register user, And let's say, what should I say here? Let's say send message to AI. And this is going to be a post request as well. So app post, and the route is going to be just /chat. And then let's say async. Okay, we're going to return, let's say promise and any. And then we're going to pass in the request and res response. All right. So the first thing I want to do is get from the body, there should be a message and there should be the user ID. Because when you register a user, you get the ID and then you're going to send that along to the chat route. So let's say const, and let's get the message and the user ID from the request.body. And then we want to just make sure that that exists. So we'll say if not message or not user ID, then we're going to want to return, let's say status 400 and JSON. We'll say message and user are required. All right, then we're going to go under that if statement, and let's open up a try catch. And in the catch, I'll just copy this response here, except we're going to change this to a 500. And then for the error, we'll just say internal server error. And in the try, first thing we're going to do is, let's say, verify user exists. So we'll say const user response. We want to set that to await on the chat client, and then we're going to use query users. Pass in an object. We want the ID to match the user ID. Okay, after we do that, let's check that response. We'll say if not user response. Remember, it has an array called users, so we're going to check that. We're going to check the length. And basically, if it's an empty array, then we know the user hasn't been found. It doesn't exist. So let's return res.status and we'll do 404 because it's the user's not found. And then we'll do JSON, and let's pass in an error. And for the error, we'll say user not found. And we'll say please register first. All right. Now, before we do anything else, let's just check if that works. So we'll just do a simple res.send and just say success. Okay, so when we make our request now to /chat, it should reach out to stream, and in the body I don't have anything, so I should get this message and user are required. So let's add in the message. I'm going to say what is the capital of Massachusetts, and then for the user ID, I'm going to put a user that doesn't exist. I'll just do 1, 2, 3. And if I send that, I get user not found, please register first. Now we know that the user ID for me, Brad_Gmail_com, we know that exists, so let's try that out, and we get success. So far, so good. Now what we want to do is start to work with OpenAI. And we're going to use the chat completions API, which will work like ChatGPT. You send it a prompt and it sends you a response. So let's go right here where I have the res.send and delete that. And let's send the message to OpenAI, and we're going to be using the GPT-4 model. So we'll say const response and set that to await Open AI, and it's going to be .chat .completions and then create. And then we want to pass in an object that has the model that we want to use, which in this case is going to be GPT. You have all these different options. We're going to do GPT-4. So that's the model we want. And then we send messages, which is going to be an array. And we're going to pass in an object here with a role of the user. And then the content is going to be the message. All right, so whatever we add in the message, which in my request is just what's the capital of Massachusetts. Now I want to show you what that gives us, so why don't we just do a console log of the response, and then as far as what we return, let's just do we'll just say res.send success. Okay, I just want to see what this gives us. So let's come back over here, and I'm going to send this same response with the message and the correct user ID. We get success, but let's take a look in the console here, and we get this object has an ID, blah blah blah. What we care about is this right here, this choices array, and there's one object in there with a message, and we can't see it here. We just see object. Yeah, I don't think we can see that, so why don't we log that? So we got console log response, and then it's going to be .choices, which is an array. We want the first and only item in that array, and we want the message. Okay, let's send it again. And there we go. So we get an object with the role as assistant. Okay, so it's the AI that's responding has a role of assistant, and then content is what we're looking for. The capital of Massachusetts is Boston. All right, so it's as easy as that to create a prompt and get back a response. So now, obviously, we want to return that response from the endpoint. So let's come back in here. We know how to access it now, right? With this, it's actually message.content. That'll give us the exact, what we're looking for. So let's get rid of the console log here around this. And let's put this into a variable. We'll say const AI message. And let's type that. It's going to be a string. And set it to that. So response choices, message content. Now I am going to use optional chaining here for message. So just add a question mark there. And then we also want to use a nullish coalescing operator, because if that happens to be null or whatever, then we're just going to make it no response from AI. That'll get rid of any TypeScript errors. Now, before we actually send this AI message back from this endpoint, we need to create a channel, which is used for managing conversations. In fact, if we go to the docs here and we search for channel and then creating channels, so it shows us how to do that. We store a reference in a variable using our client and then .channel, pass in the type, which is going to be messaging. Okay, there's different types. If we come down here and look at type, you have live stream, messaging, team, gaming, commerce. Messaging is for one-on-one conversations or group chats. That's typical type for things like that. And we're having a one-on-one chat with, it's just not with a user, it's with the AI. So that's what we're going to use. And then once we store the reference, we can then call channel.create, and then we can actually do channel.send message as well, which will send the message through the channel. It'll get stored and so on. So let's do that. Let's go right below the AI message, and let's say, actually I'm going to just put a comment here. Let's say create channel, or it's actually create or get channel. And we're going to create the reference with our chat client dot channel. The type is going to be messaging. And we can also pass in a unique ID, which I'm going to use backticks, and then just say chat dash. and then the user ID. So that'll be a unique identifier. And then we want to pass in an object with the name of the channel, which I'm going to call, we'll call it AI chat. And then we also need to add this created underscore by underscore ID, which if you were chatting with another user, then it would be that user. But since we're using an AI, we're going to call it AI bot. All right, so that will create the reference. Now we need to call channel.create, like I just showed you in the docs. And then after that, we can do, sorry, this needs await. And then after that, we can do await channel.send message and pass in an object with the text, which will be the AI message. So AI message. And then the user ID, and make sure you do user underscore ID. That's what the key is. It's not camel case, it's underscore. And then that's going to be the AI bot that sends this message. Okay, now as far as what we want to respond with, let's do res.json. Actually, we'll do status 200.json and then pass in an object. Oops. Pass in an object with a reply, and that reply will be the AI message. Whoops. Not al message, AI. Okay, so yeah, that should do it. And then I just want to do a console log here as well if there is an error. Let's put error generating AI response, and then also the error. All right, cool. So let's try that out. I'm going to come over here and I have my message. I have my user ID. Let's go ahead and send. And we get an object with the reply. The capital of Massachusetts is Boston. And what's cool is now if we go back to the stream dashboard and if we go to, Chat Messaging Explorer, we have the AI bot user here. And you can see under channels, we have messaging. So that's the type, and then we have the unique identifier, which is chat-brad@gmail.com, because I set that right here, right? That's the unique identifier. And then we should be able to see any messages that are in through that channel. So we have one message here, and it shows the text, which is the capital of Massachusetts is Boston. So whatever the AI sent us back. So pretty cool. Now what I'd like to do is implement our own database. I mean, we do have the you can see the chats and users and stuff through Stream, but a lot of times you'll want to do more with it. So you'll want to store the chat logs in your own database. So I want to expand this to do that and also store our users. So you want to create a Postgres database through Neon. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. All right, and then we're going to go to, I guess we'll create a new project. So once you log in, and this interface is so easy to use, and it's so easy to set up a database. It's basically just a couple clicks. So I do want to create a new project. I'll call this tutorial. And you can choose your Postgres version. I'm going to stick with 17. Your database name, I'm going to call this chat AI DB, and I'll just choose AWS and then create. And you can do a lot from this interface. I mean, you can run straight SQL queries. There's branching. So just like you have branching with GitHub with your code, you have branching with your databases. So if you want to, add a new feature and you don't want to affect the main branch, you can just create a new branch, work with that. Once that's all set and that's what you want to use, then you can merge the branches. So really cool. And what we want to do now is just click connect, and that will give us our connection string. So right here, we want to copy this, and actually let's click show password too, and then copy. And we want to store that reference to the database, or the database string, in our .env. So let's go in there. And let's call this database underscore URL and go ahead and paste that in. All right, so now that we have that, we need a way to interact with our database, and that's where Drizzle comes in. Drizzle is an ORM. It's TypeScript based. It's really easy to use. But one thing we do have to do, since we're using Neon, is use the Neon database serverless adapter. So we do have to install that as well. So let's come down to the terminal here, and let's run npm install, and we want Drizzle -orm, and then we also want to install at Neon database /serverless. Okay, so it just allows us to use Drizzle and to use this with Neon's infrastructure. And then we also want to install Drizzle kit as a dev dependency. So let's say npm install -D, and then drizzle-kit. And this is a CLI, and we can run migrations from it and stuff. Okay, so now that those are installed, a couple things we have to do, a few files we need to create. So one is going to be our database config file, which I'm going to put in the source folder. I'll create a new folder called config. And then in that config, we'll have a database.ts file. And this is where we configure that Neon database adapter. So let's go ahead and import a couple things here. First one is going to be Neon, and that's going to be from this right here, Neon database /serverless. Then we want Drizzle. So import Drizzle, and let's see, we're going to bring that in from Drizzle ORM, and then it's going to be /neon HTTP. And then we want to bring in from the .env package, we want to bring in the config function because we're going to be using environment variables. So let's go ahead and load environment variables, and we do that by calling config. And then since I have this in the source folder, then in the config folder, I'm just going to specify the path to the .env file. You can do that by passing in an object like this. Just say the path, and it's just .env because it's in the root, okay, because that's going to start in the root. All right, then we just want to check for the database URL. So if not, process.env.database_URL, then let's throw a new error, and we'll say database_URL is undefined. Okay, so we get that. Next thing, we want to initialize the Neon client. So actually, I'm going to put a comment here. So init the Neon client, and we're going to put that in a variable called SQL. So we set that to Neon, and that's going to get passed in the database URL. So process.env.database_URL. And then we need to initialize Drizzle, and that's going to be exported because we're going to be using this in other files. So we're going to call this variable of db, and then we set that to Drizzle, and that gets passed in the SQL variable, which is the Neon client. So we can close that file up, and now we want to create our schema. And if you've used like Mongoose or Sequelize or Prisma, we create a model or a schema of our data, and then we can use DrizzleKit to run the migration looking at that schema, and it will create the tables for us. So I'm going to put this in, let's see, we'll have it in the source folder. I'll have a folder called db, and then in db we'll have a schema.ts file. All right, so let's start off by importing what we need from Drizzle. So we need pg table, which is going to create Postgres tables for us. And that's going to come in from Drizzle ORM/pg core. So in addition to that, any field types that you want to use, you bring in here. So for instance, serial, which is what our primary key IDs are going to be, and then text, and then timestamp. I believe those are the only ones we need. So what we do now is export for any table we want to create. We export PG table function that takes in the name of the table and then all the fields we want to use. So for instance, for the chats, let's say const chats, and we want to set that to PG table, and the name of the table will be chats, and then we pass in an object with all the fields that we want. So for instance, the ID is going to be a serial type, serial field, and that's going to be named ID. And then I want that to be the primary key, so we can tack on dot primary key. Next thing we want is the user ID. So that's going to be text and user underscore ID. And then let's see, that's going to also be not null. So we'll tack that on. Then we have the message. So let's say message of the chat. And this will be message as well. Then we want the reply, which will be the the message that's sent back from the AI. So that'll be text as well, and reply, and not null. All right, and then the last thing I want here is created at. So created at is going to be a timestamp, and that's going to also be called created underscore at, and let's add on to that. I'm going to use default now, which will do the current timestamp, and that should also be, need parentheses there, that should also be not null. All right, so that's our chats. Now let's do the users, because I want to store users as well. So we'll say const users on exports. So const users, set that to PG table, and the name of the table will also be users, and then we want to pass in all of our fields. So first thing is going to be the user ID, which will be text, and user ID for the column name, and this is going to be the primary key, so we want to add that. All right, then we got the name, so name will be text as well, name for the column name, and not null. All right, then we got email. So let's change this and this to email. And then we want a created at, so I'm just going to copy this one because it's the same thing. Okay, so those are the two schemas and the two tables we want to create. Now, Drizzle is really great when it comes to TypeScript. We can have our type inference inference for Drizzle queries. So basically, when we insert a chat, for instance, it's going to be structured in a specific way with a specific type. And we can add that here, the type inference, for the chat insert, for the chat select, for the user insert, and for the user select. So we want to export these so we can use them outside of this file, and we're going to say type and then chat insert, and we want to set that to type of and then chats, and we want this infer insert, okay, money sign infer insert. And then we want to do the same for the chat select, which is going to be infer select, and change this to chat select. Okay, and then we want to do the same thing for users. So what I'll do is just grab both of these and copy those down, and then we're going to change this first one here to user insert, and make sure we change this to users. And then this one here, change that to users, and this one is going to be user select, like that. Okay, so that takes care of the type inference for those types, for insert and selects. Now, we want to create a config file for Drizzle or for Drizzle Kit, because it needs to know where the schemas are, it needs to know where the migrations will go, things like that. So that this is going to go in the root, because that's where it looks. So in the root, not in the source, but in the root, we're going to create a drizzle.config.ts. All right, and we want to import, let's see, we're going to be using .env, so we want to bring in the config from that. So that's going to be from .env, and then we're going to import define config, and that's going to come from Drizzle kit. And then let's just run, let's say config, because we're going to be using the environment variables to get the database URL. And again, I'm just going to specify path, and it's just in the root.env. Okay, and then we want to export as default, define config, and then that's going to get passed in a couple things. So first is going to be schema, and that's going to point to what we just created, which is going to be from the root in the source folder, and then in the DB, and then schema.ts. Okay, so that's our schema. Then we have out. So this is going to be the migrations folder. So just it's going to be /migrations. All right, then we have the dialect. So dialect, I mean, you can use Drizzle with different databases, MySQL, etc. We're using Postgres. In fact, you can see the options here. So we're going to use Postgres. And then for the DB credentials, that's going to be an object, and we just need to provide the URL, which is going to be our process.env.database URL. And let's just add a bang on the end of that. All right, so that's our config. So we can close that up. Now, since that Drizzle config is in the root directory, we are probably going to have an issue with TypeScript because it's compiling the source folder, right? So we can run into an issue there. So what we can do is exclude that file. So under compiler options, right? So it ends right here. So under compile options, we're going to add exclude, and it's going to be an array, and we just want to add in that file. So we want drizzle, what is it, drizzle.config.ts. And that just cleared up that error that was there. Okay, so now we have our schema created, so that means that we're ready to create our migration. And when we create our migration, we first generate it, and then we do drizzle kit generate, and then drizzle kit migrate, and that should actually create our tables for us based on this, based on the schema. So let's try that. Let's come down here, and let's run, well, we need npx and drizzle-kit, and then we want to do generate first. Okay, so your SQL migration file. So it created that here. And then, and you'll see there's a migrations folder here now. Then to actually migrate, we want to do npx drizzle kit migrate. All right, so let's see, you can only connect to remote supervised instance through a WebSocket. Not exactly sure why it's saying that. It is a warning, so let's go to our Neon dashboard and let's check it out. So if we go to tables and we have our chats, yep, chats table, you can see the fields here, ID, user ID, message, and we have our users table. Okay, so that worked. I'm not exactly sure. Can only connect to remote Neon Vercel Postgres through a WebSocket. I guess I'm just not going to worry about that right now because it did work. It created our tables from our schema, which is what should have happened. So now let's integrate the database into our endpoints, into the register user and into the chats, because again, we want to save the users, we want to save the chats. Actually, let's bring in up top what we need to first. Okay, so we're going to import, we want our DB, right? So DB, which is going to come from our database. Now, this is something that I want to mention. When you're using TypeScript with Node, with TSX, and you have the configuration that we do, when you import a file, because this is the first file that we've imported, the rest have just been, package modules. So it says JS even though it's a TS file. Okay, you can't do import TS. That's not going to work. It's going to give you an error. So even though it says JS, everything to do with TypeScript, compilation, everything is just, it still works fine. This is just the syntax we have to use. So in addition to that, we want to bring in our schemas, so chats and users, and that's going to come in from /db and then /schema, and again we're going to do schema.js even though it's a TS file. And then let's see, what else do we need? There's a utility called EQ to basically compare values, to compare the users and so on. So that's going to be EQ from Drizzle ORM. And then what else do we have here? The chat completion message param type. So we're going to bring that in as well. So chat completion, I don't see it here, completion message right here. So that's going to come from OpenAI resources MJS. Actually, we don't need the MJS, I don't think. Yeah, that should work. Okay, so now that we have our imports, let's figure out where we actually want to use the database. So we have our register user, right? So that creates a user with stream, but again, we want to also save the users in our own database. So I'm going to go down right above the response, okay, after we deal with all the stream stuff, and let's check for existing user in the database. I know we checked for if it's in stream, but we also want to check in our own database. So let's say const existing user, and I'm just going to close that up. And we want to set that to await, and this is where we use the DB, right? So DB from our config file, database config. And then I'm going to call a few different methods on this. One is select. So I want to select from the users table where, so dot where. This is just the syntax of Drizzle, which I like. It's pretty clean. So where, now this is where we use that EQ utility. So we want to pass in EQ, and we want to see where users dot user ID is equal to the user ID. Okay, and that the user ID would be, you know, what we create from the email when a user is registered. So it's going to check for that, and it's going to put it in this variable. Now, let's come down under it, and let's say if not existing user, we'll say if not existing user dot length, then let's just, well, first off, we'll just do a console log, and I'll put some backticks in here, and we'll say user, and then the user ID, we'll say does not exist in the database, and we'll say adding them, because that's what we're going to do. All right, so under that line, let's await DB, and then we're going to call insert, and we want to insert into users where values, okay, so the values we want to add, pass in an object here with the user ID, the name, and the email. All right, and that should be it. So let's save it now, and I'm going to come back to Postman. So let's send a request. So I'm going to make a post request to HTTP. We want to do register user, and in the body for form data, let's add a name and an email. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and send that. All right, so I get back what I'm supposed to. Now we want to check the database. So let's go to Neon. I'm just going to reload this. And there's the user. So user ID, which is also the primary key, the name, email, and the created at. So now not only do we have the users in the Chat Explorer and the stream, we have it in our own database, which we can do whatever we want with. right? And I had deleted the user before, so there it is again. All right, so in addition to the users in the database, we also want to store the chats. So let's go back to server TS and let's go down to the chat endpoint and figure out where we want to use the database here. So let's see, we're getting the user response here, right? Then we check the user response. So let's go right under that and we'll say check user in database. So again, we're going to do const. Actually, I can just copy the line of code I just put here. Okay, so we'll add that here. And then actually we can take what we put after that too, which is this. Except we're not going to create the user, so we do have to change that. So right under where we check the user, let's paste that. And we're going to get rid of this insert. We don't want to do that. And then for the, actually we're not even going to do a console log. We want to return an error if the user isn't there. So let's say return and then res.status, and we'll do a 404. And let's do JSON error, and we'll set the error. We'll say user not found in database. Please register first. Okay, so we're making it so that if the user isn't in our Postgres database, our Neon database, then it's not going to let it happen, right? The user has to exist in stream, and it has to exist in our database. So now let's go under where we get the AI message and store that. And let's say save, we'll say save chat to database. So to do that, we can just say await db.insert. We want to insert into the chats or the chats table. And then for values, we're going to add the user ID. We want the message, the reply. Actually, reply, we're going to set that to AI message. Okay, so we're just taking whatever this is, right, and we're just storing it as reply. And that's it. So now we can try that out. So I'm going to come over here and let's make a request to /chat. And we're going to change the stuff here. So let's say message. And let's do something different. Let's do something a little more difficult, like create a simple. Let's see, what should we do? We'll say create a simple REST API with Python. So that's our message. And then for the user ID, I'm going to put my user, which is going to be brad_gmail_com. So let's try that out. And it might take a couple seconds. Obviously, the more difficult the answer, the longer it's going to take. Okay, so we got our reply, and it has a bunch of new line characters and stuff for formatting. And we'll when we create our UI with Vue, we'll have this displaying nicely. So here's a simple example on how to create a REST API using Flask, a micro web framework in Python, and it goes through and gives us the steps. All right, so we know that's working. Now let's make sure that got saved to the database. So we'll go to Neon, and I'm going to go to chats, and there it is, message, create a simple REST API, reply. There's the reply. Now, since we implemented a database, I'd like to add one more route to get the messages of a specific user. Okay, and we're going to need that for our UI because obviously when you're, sending messages as a user, you only want your messages. So let's create a new route. We're going to come down here and let's say we want to get chat history for a user. So app.post, and let's see, the endpoint is going to be /get-messages, and we want to do async return promise any. Okay, I'll pass in here our requests. So request and res, which will be response. All right, so what I'm going to do first is it's going to take a user ID, so we'll destructure the user ID from request.body because that needs to be sent with the body. And then let's check for the user ID, or check if not user ID. And if not, then we're going to return res.status, and we'll do 400, and we'll pass in an error and say user ID is required. All right, so if the user ID is there, then let's open up a try catch, and let's create a variable here. We'll call it chat history. So chat history, and then we want to await db, and then we're going to select. I'm going to go on the next line here. So db.select, and from, okay, we want to select from chats, and let's say where. So where, and we're going to use EQ here because we're comparing. So we want to say where the chats.user ID is equal to the user ID. And then we're going to return, actually we can just do res.status 200.json, and let's pass in, we'll do messages and set that to the chat history. Okay, and then if there's an error, then we're going to res.status 500, and let's we'll pass in an error, and we'll say internal server error. And then I do want to just do a console log as well. So we'll say, actually, let's do quotes and say error fetching chat history, and we'll output the error. Okay, so that's our get messages. So let's try that out. I'm going to come over here, post request to /get-messages, and then we just want the user ID in the body. So I'm going to go ahead and send, and now it gives me back an array, and you see we have ID1, user ID, message, and then the reply. I should have my other one here. Actually, no, I deleted the other one. So let's make another, let's do another chat. And then for the message, make sure we check that. Let's say, what is the most popular JS framework? Send. As of 20, okay, so the 2021 is the cutoff for this. It says the most popular JavaScript framework is React. All right, so now if I were to go back to get-messages with the user ID, I should have both. So create a simple REST API and what is the most popular JS framework. Okay, so we have three routes. We register a user, we use that user to chat, to ask a question to the AI, and then we have an endpoint to get all the messages of a specific user. So that's pretty much it as far as the back end. There's a couple things later on while we're doing the front end that I want to add to the back end, but I think that I'll be able to explain it better once we have the UI. And I know that back-end development like this can be a little tricky and can be a little weird because you're not looking at like a user interface for the results of what you're doing. You're just seeing a bunch of data, so it can be tough for some people. So if you've been confused through this, don't worry about it. I mean, it happens as you do more of it. It'll kind of click. But now what I'd like to do is jump into the front end, create a whole new folder for our Chat AI UI, and start to use Vue.js. Okay, so now we're going to get into our front end, and like I said, we're going to be using Vue.js version 3. We're going to be using a couple other dependencies, so let me just show you those real quick. So Vue, we're using Vite for our dev server and environment. We're using Pinia for our state management library, so we'll be able to create a store for our users, for our chats. We'll be able to have our actions and our state in those stores. Axios I'm using for my HTTP library, although if you want to use fetch, that's fine too. Really doesn't matter. It's just preference. And then TailwindCSS I'm using for the styling, so we will be adding quite a bit of Tailwind classes to make it look nice. Vue router, we're using the official router for Vue. And we're just going to have two routes, two pages. One is going to be the home page with the form that has the email and the name so that you can, enter your name to start chatting. And then, of course, the chat route, chat page where you interact with the AI. And then TypeScript, which we don't have to set up at all. It just works out of the box with Vite. So those are our front-end dependencies. Now, I have the back-end running, so you definitely want to have that. This is just something I was testing out. But you can see mine's running on port 8000. And then I'm going to go into the Chat AI folder, and you can see I have the backend. That's what's running over here. I want to create a folder alongside of this in my Chat AI folder, not inside the API folder. That's the backend. This is completely separate. So alongside that, let's go ahead and run npx, and then I'm going to use create v, and let's call this chat-ai-ui. Okay, so this is the user interface part of our application. And then we're going to choose Vue. I'm going to choose TypeScript, although if you want to use JavaScript, that's fine too. I mean, even if you don't know TypeScript, we're not doing that much, so you should be fine. And we already used it in the back end, and it's much easier to set up. I mean, there really is no setup in the front end. It just works. So now let's go ahead and cd into chat AI-UI, and then let's run our npm install to install our initial dependencies that come with Vite, and then we'll install a couple other dependencies as well. All right, so let's go npm install and vue-router. We want Pinia for our state management, and there's also a plugin called persisted state, and we want to use this because we want our state, our user, to persist across page loads. So we're going to install Pinia-plugin-persisted state, and then also Axios. So those are our front end, those are our regular dependencies. And then for dev dependencies, it's just Tailwind and the plugin for Vite for Tailwind. So let's do dash uppercase D and then Tailwind CSS, and then also at Tailwind CSS / Vite. And Tailwind version 4 is super easy to get set up with Vite. Okay, so now that we have our dependencies set up, I'm going to actually just open this folder up in VS Code. And I'm going to run the dev server from the integrated terminal. So from here, let's say npm run dev. And it's going to be 5173 for the port by default. And I'm just going to make this, I'm going to just bring this over here, make this a little smaller. Okay, so this is just a landing page. We're going to get rid of the boilerplate. What I do want to do is set up Tailwind, which is really easy. We just need to go into our Vite config first, and we're going to import Tailwind CSS from, and then it's going to be this at Tailwind CSS / Vite, and then we just need to add the plugin to the array here. So Tailwind CSS parentheses, And then the only other thing we need to do is go into our main style sheet. So in the source folder, I want to go into style CSS, and we can get rid of all this other stuff and just simply do at import and then in quotes TailwindCSS. And that's it. And you can see Tailwind's working because it's all the same font size. There's no padding or margin on the body. So Tailwind is working. All right, now let's just clear this up a little bit. I don't want the hello world component, so we can completely delete that. Okay, and then in the app.view, we don't want that. I'll leave the script tag there. And then in the template, actually we can get rid of the scope style. And then in the template for now, let's just have, an H1, and we'll just say my app. Okay, so just kind of clear everything out. And in the assets, we don't need the Vue SVG. You can get rid of that. Now I do have a little robot icon and logo that I want to use. So let me just find that real quick. You guys can get this from the GitHub repository that's in the description. Let me just find it real quick. Let's see, dev. I'm just trying to find it off screen. Where are we? Chat AI UI. All right, so it's going to be in, you have the favicon, which is in the root. So just bring that over to your root. And then you have in the source assets folder, there's a robot PNG. You're going to bring that into your assets folder. So it's just this little robot guy. All right, now to add the favicon, we can go into the index.html in our in the root, and I'm just going to change the page title to, let's do Chat AI. And then for the favicon, we'll just add a link. And let's change the rel to icon. We'll add a type of image / it's an ICO, and then / favicon ICO, and then you should see the little robot in the tab. All right, so right off the bat, I just want to set up routing, okay, because we're using Vue router. We're going to have the home route. We're going to have a chat route. So let's start by creating those pages or those views. So in the source, we're going to create a folder called views, and then in there, we're going to create a file called home. Let's call it homeview.vue, VUE, and then let's create another file called chatview.vue. Okay, and then I'm just going to have a script tag, and then we're going to add our setup. So as far as Vue.js goes, this is not an intro to Vue. I'm not going to explain the basics. I have a Vue course, a Vue crash course on YouTube that I just did like a couple months ago, so it's really up to date. If you don't know anything or you know very little about Vue.js, I would suggest watching that. I mean, you can watch it after if you want, so you can kind of understand what you did, but I would suggest watching it before. But basically with the composition API, which is a kind of a more modern way of building Vue components, you basically have to have in your script, you would export a setup function, right? And then you do all your JavaScript, all your state stuff you would do in here, but you can do a shortcut by just adding setup here. That's why I'm doing that. And then I'm also just going to add lang, and since I'm using TypeScript, I'm going to add lang ts. And then I'm not even going to put anything in there for now. Then we have our template, so basically the HTML we want to show on this in this component or in this page, which right now I don't really care. We'll just do an H1 and we'll just say chat or chat page. All right, and then for the home view, I'm just going to grab that and we'll just change this to home page. All right, because I just want to get these created so that we can set up our router. So we can close those up for now. And then for the router, we're going to have a folder in the source folder called router. And then in that, we'll have a file called index.ts. And this is where we set up our routes. Now, to do that, we need to import a couple things. So first off, we need create router from Vue router. And then we also want a function called create web history. which allows us to use the HTML5 history API to do routing instead of actual page loads. And then we also want to bring in any views or any components that we want to load. So that would be the home view, and that would be the chat view. Okay, then what we do is create an array for our routes. So we'll set that to an array, and each route will have an object with a path. So in this case, I want this to be just slash for the home page, and then we can load a component, which our views are our components. So let's set that to the home view. All right, and then we'll do the same thing for the chat view. So let's make this slash chat, and this will be for the component chat view. Then what we want to do is export const router. So this is what we bring into other files, and this is where we want to set this to create router, which is going to take in an object with history, and we want to set that to the create web history. Again, that's going to use the HTML5 history API, and that's a function, so you want your parentheses, and then you just want to pass in your routes as well. All right, and that's it for that file. Now, a couple other things we need to do before we can actually use our router. We need to initialize it in the main.ts file, which is basically our entry point. So in this file, let's see, we're going to bring in, and we want create router. I'm sorry, not create router, just router. We already used that in our router file that we just created, and that's what we're bringing in here. So router from /router. Now we have to use that, so where we have this create app, which bootstraps the entire application, it mounts it to this element with app. I'm going to just put this in a variable, and then we'll mount it down below. So we'll take this and we'll do app.mount here instead, and that way we can take that app object and we can call use, and then we can use the router. Okay, so we get that done. Now the last thing, to be able to see the routes on the page, in the main app.view, where we have this h1, we want to replace that with router view. Save that, and now we see home page because we're on the home route. If I go to /chat, then we're on the chat page. And if you want to create just a quick navigation, we can do nav, and then we can use router link. Okay, so router link, we can add a to attribute here to slash, and then we'll have one to chat /chat, and then we should be able to click on chat, takes us to the chat page, home takes us to the home page. Now we do need to set up our store, but before we do that, let's just get the form displayed on the home page. And we can get rid of this nav, we don't need that. Okay, so let's go into, let's see, we want to go into the home view, and I'm going to bring in that robot image because that's going to be our logo. So let's import robot image from, and then it's going to be /assets/ and then robot.png. Okay, so we'll bring that in, and then let's just start to add some of the elements down here and use our Tailwind classes. So we're going to have a div that wraps everything. Get rid of this. Div, and then for classes here, we're going to do h-screen. Let's make this a flex box and align everything to the center. So items-center and justify center. I'm not going to explain what every Tailwind class does. I have Tailwind crash courses. I have a premium course if you want that. But it's pretty obvious what most of these classes do. Background, we're going to make gray. Let's do 900 for the shade. And then we're going to do text white. Okay, so that just gives us this dark background. Then inside that, I'm going to have another div with a class of let's do padding 8, and I'm going to do BG gray 800, make it a little lighter, and rounded large. Let's do shadow large, and let's make it width -full and a max width of medium. All right, whoops. I don't know what happened. Oh, I need to do this. All right, so there's our container for the form. So in that div, let's have an H1. We'll do text dash. Let's do 2XL for the sizing. We'll say font dash semi-bold. Let's do margin bottom 4 and text center. And in that, we'll say welcome to Chat AI. All right. Oh, I forgot the robot. So let's actually put above the H1, I'm going to have my image. Now, since the source is going to be pointed to a variable, right, it's dynamic, we need to bind it. So we could either do a v-on, or we can just put a colon here and then set it to something dynamic, such as the robot image variable. And then I'm just going to add a couple classes on this as well. So let's do mx, so margin on the x-axis, auto, width 24, height 24, and then let's do margin bottom 4. And there we go. So now I have the little robot guy, and then let's go under the H1, and we want to have our inputs. So for the classes here, we're going to do dash width dash full. Let's do padding 2 for margin bottom 2. And then I'm going to do a BG gray 700, so make it a little lighter. The text will be white. Let's say rounded dash large. And then I'm also going to add a focus style. So on focus, I want outline dash none. Okay. Yeah, and then let's add a couple other things. So in addition to, whoops, what did I do here? That should be there. So I want to add a placeholder, and it's going to say name. And then we want to bind this name to a reactive variable. We want to have a piece of component state called name, and we do that with v-model, and we will set that to name. And we want to create that name variable up top here in the script. So let's say const name, and we set that to ref. Okay, we're creating a reactive value. So ref, and then whatever the default is will go in here, which is going to be an empty string. Now that ref, we do have to import that from Vue. So let's bring that in. That should be lowercase r. Okay, there we go. So now that gets bound to that. If I put in, hello here, it's going to show here because that is bound to that input. Okay, and then we'll have some other values here as well, like the email. And let's see, do I want to add the rest of this stuff now? Yeah, might as well. Just copy this down. So we're going to have a loading state. So basically, when we reach out to our API, we're going to set loading to true, and then when we get the result, it'll be set to back to false. So let's set this to ref. Default value will be false. And then I also want for error, if we have an error, I want to have that in our state as well. That'll just be an empty string by default as well. And then let's come back down. Let's create our email input. So I'm going to take this, copy it down. Let's change the type to email. And let's see, we'll change the placeholder to email and the v-model to email. So now this input is going to pertain, or is going to be bound to this variable. If I save it, we see the email. And then let's create the button. Okay, so right here, let's say button. And as far as classes go, let's do width dash full. Let's do padding 2. We'll do BG blue dash 500 and rounded large. All right, and inside that, I want it to say start chat, but if it's loading, then I want it to show logging in. Okay, and it's not actually a login, but you know what I mean, creating the user or just getting the user. So if you want to show something dynamic within your Vue template, you use double curly braces. So here I can put a JavaScript expression like if it's loading, then show logging in ... else, then show start chat. So now we have our start chat button. And then I also want to make this button disabled if loading is true. So it's going to be dynamic. So I'm going to do :disabled because what I'm setting this to is a variable, right? It's loading. So if I were to set loading up here, I know a lot of you guys know this stuff, but for those of you that are kind of new to Vue, if I set that, now it's disabled and it says logging in. So I'll set that back to false. All right, now let's see. For the error, I want to show that down here in a paragraph. So in the paragraph, we can use a VIF directive, which is just like an if statement. Whatever I put in here will only show if this is true. So for VIF, we just want to set that to error. So if error is true, then I just want to show the actual error. And we'll just add a class. Let's add a class of text-red. We'll do red 400 and text center. And let's do margin top 2. Okay, so if I have an error, which we can test out by just putting something in here, then it will show like that. All right, cool. Now that button is going to call a function. So let's go to the button here. We'll say @click. So when we click this, we're going to call a function called createUser, which doesn't exist yet. So we're going to go up here, and we want to create the createUser function. So here, let's say const createUser. We'll set that to an async function, and let's check for the name and email. So we'll say if not name, and we can access the value with .value, or if not email .value. Okay, so if either one of those are not added, then I want to set an error. So we'll say error.value, and we'll set that to, let's say, name and email are required. And then we'll just return. Okay, and then I think, I think that's as far as I want to go, because we don't have our store yet. Because what we're going to do is send a request to, well, we could, we'll send the request. I'm trying to think of how the order I want to do this in. Do we want to do the store first? Yeah, you know what? Before we do the request, let's do the store. I mean, we can test out this little validation. If I were to click Start Chat without putting anything, then it's going to give us an error. But yeah, let's create our store. So basically, when the data comes back from /register_user from our backend, it's going to be stored in our user store, which we have yet to create. So we're using Pinia, which means we have to initialize it. So we're going to go into our main.ts, which is right here. And a couple things we need to do. Yeah, we'll go right here, and let's import here, create Pinia from Pinia. And then we also need that plugin, which is Pinia plugin persisted state. That's going to come from, it's going to come from this right here. Okay, so we want to bring those in, and then let's go above this app. Let's say const Pinia, set that to the create Pinia function, and then we should be able to take that Pinia object and say .use, and we can use the plugin. So Pinia plugin persisted state, we want to pass that in. And then the only other thing we need to do is use it just like we did the router, so copy that down and pass in Pinia. Okay, I don't have the code right in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that's right. All right, so we'll close that up. Now to create our store, let's go into the source folder, create a folder called stores, and for each resource we'll have a file. So I want to create a file called user.ts. So this is where our global state goes, as well as any actions, which are going to be functions that mutate the state in some way. So what we're going to do is import define store, and that's going to be from Pinia. All right, and then we're going to export. Let's export const, and we're going to call this use user store. And we want to set that to that defined store, and then that's going to take in a name of our store, so user, and then we pass in an object, and this is where we can define our state, which is going to be set to an arrow function, and it's going to be set to it's going to return an object, and that object we're going to have our user ID, and we're using TypeScript, so I'm going to say null as string or null. So what we're doing is using a type assertion, and we're defining it as null to begin with, but we're saying it can be null or a string. And then we're going to do the same thing with the name. Okay, so if you remember, when we hit that register user route, it sends back the user ID, the name, and the email. We don't need the email in the project, so I'm not going to store it in the store. If you want to, you can, but I'm just going to leave it out for now. So in addition to our state, we want to have our actions. So let's put a comma here and then actions. And actions is an object with functions in it to manipulate the state in some way. So let's create a function called setUser. And setUser is going to take in a data object. So for the type, it's going to be an object that has a user ID, which will be a string, and also name, which will be a string. And we can access this, right? These values in our state, we can access with the this keyword. So we can say this dot user ID is going to be set to the user ID that's passed in here. I'm sorry, it's going to be data dot user ID. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing with the name. So this, set that. So this dot name is going to equal data dot name. Then let's go under set user, because we also want to have a logout, because we need a way to clear this state. So here we'll say this dot user ID is equal to null, and then this dot name is equal to null. And then the last thing we're going to do is persist the state, meaning that the user will stay even if the page refreshes or reloads. So we're going to go right here, put a comma, and we can add in here persist, and we're just going to set that to true. And I'll put a little comment here and just say keep user logged in across page reloads. And that should do it. So that's our user store. And we'll have a chat store later on. So now let's go back to our home view, and we're going to import we want to import the use user store that we just created. That's going to be from, and then / stores / user. Okay, and then we're going to be redirecting the user as well, so we're also going to import use router from view router. Now we have to initialize these two things. So right here, let's say const user, so user store, set that to use user store. Why is that? Oh, I just haven't used it, right? Yeah. Okay, so then also the router, so let's say const router, set that to use router. All right, now we have access to the user store, so let's make our request down here in the create user. So after this if statement, let's first off set the loading value and set that to true, because we're now loading because we're making a request. And let's just make sure the error value is clear. And then I'm going to use a try catch for the request. Now, for as far as the URL that we make the request to, for me, it's going to be HTTP localhost 8000. But when you go into production, obviously that's going to change. So we should put that in an environment variable. So let's go into the root, not the source, but in the root, and let's create a .env. And here we're going to say vt so these are going to be prefixed with vt, and then API underscore URL, and we'll set that to HTTP localhost 8000. If you ran it on a different port, make sure you put that. All right, so that way we can just have one central place for that URL. Now let's make the request, and I'm using Axios, by the way, so I have to import that as well. Let's see. So import Axios, and then let's say const. I'm going to destructure the data. If you're using fetch, then you would do that here, but I'm going to await on axios.post. Okay, and then we want to pass in the API URL. So I'm going to use backticks here, and then our our template literal syntax, and let's say import.meta.env. This is how we access those environment variables, and then vt underscore API underscore URL. Okay, so that's where we want to go, and then slash. So after the closing curly brace, slash register dash user. So we're making a request to our back end. Now we also want to pass in, after that backtick, a comma, and then we want to pass in the data that we're sending, which is going to be our name. And remember, we access that with name.value, and then email. So this will be email.value. And then once we do that, we can then set the user data in our store to the data that we get back. Okay, so let's do that. We're going to say user store, and then we're going to call our set user action. We're going to pass in the user ID, set that to the data.user ID, and then we want to do the same thing with the name. So this will be name, name, and then it'll be data.name. Okay, so we're setting it to our store, and then the last thing we want to do in the try is just redirect, so router.push, and we want to go to /chat. And then in the catch, let's do, we'll say error.value, and set that to, we'll just say something went wrong, and we'll say please try again. Okay, let's see, did I set this? Oh, you know what, let's make this ERR, because we can't have that being error and the state being error. All right, and then we want to set the loading to false no matter what, whether it's an error or not, so we can add a finally. So right here, finally, and then we'll set the loading dot value to false. Okay, so that should do it, right? So again, just to kind of reiterate, we click the button, it calls create user, and checks the name and value inputs, sets loading to true, then we make our request to our backend, which we already created, send the name and email, we get back the user ID, the name and email, and we're storing the user ID and the name in our state, right, in our front-end UI state. Then we're just redirecting to chat, and we're setting loading back to false. So let's try this out. I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to refresh the page here. And then let's do, like, I'll say John Doe, or just John, and John at gmail.com. Start chat, says logging in, redirects me to the chat page, right? Now I should be able to check, I can check this in a few places. I can check stream, or I can check Neon. So we'll do both. I'm going to go back here to my Explorer and Stream, And if we look at users, you'll see right here, John Gmail.com. So that's who I just registered as, right? And then if we go to our Neon console and go to users, John Gmail.com. So now our front end is connecting to our back end, sending a request, signing up with both, setting it in stream, setting it to our own database so that we have our own store of users for whatever you want to do with them. Sets a channel, and that's it. Now what we need to do is create this chat page so that we can interact with the AI. However, before we do that, I'd like to have a header at the top because we do need a way to log out. I say log out, but it's not actual authentication, but you know what I mean. Just make the user know, right? The user ID in the email. So let's create a component. We're going to go into the components folder and let's create a header.vue file. Okay, and we're going to add our script. Let's add our setup. So setup, and for the lang, set that to TS. And then we'll have our template. Okay, so in our template, I'm going to have a div with padding y. Let's do py4 px-6 bg-gray 800. Let's do shadow-md. Make this a flex box. We want to justify between, and let's do items-center. All right, so within that div, I'm going to have the robot image, which I need to bring in. So up here, just close that up. So up here, let's import that. So import robot image, and that's going to be from ..assets/robot.png. All right. So for the source, I'm going to just add a colon here since this is a dynamic variable. Let's say robot image. And let's see, just a couple classes on this. So class is going to be W, so width-8 and height-8. And we'll just say for the alt, chat AI. Now we want to bring this header in. It's not finished yet, but I just want to be able to see it. So it's only going to be on the chat page. It doesn't have to be on the home page. So we're not going to put it in, the main app file. We'll put it right in chat. So in the chat view, let's go ahead and import header. And let's see, we'll just get rid of this H1 here. I do want to have a div though with just a couple classes. So let's do flex. I'm going to do flex-call, h-screen, bg. Let's do gray 900 and text-white. And then in that, we'll put our header. And there we go. So looks pretty good. So back to, let's see, home view, we can close up. But back in the header, let's finish this up. I'm going to put under the image here an H1 with a class of text large and font semi-bold. And we'll say AI, or chat AI. Now it's way over on the right because I have justify between, so all the space is in between, but I'm going to put a logout button, so this will be pushed over into the middle and the logout button will be on the end. So let's add button, and I'm going to do text gray 400, and also on hover. So hover will make text-white, and inside of it will say logout. Okay, so there's that. Now when we click it, let's go ahead and add an event handler. So we want to click. So when we click, it's going to call a function called logout. Now the logout function is the action in the store, right? If I go to my user store, we have this logout action. So we can bring this in to our header and use it. So up at the top here, let's Let's import, and whenever you want to use the user store, you need to bring in use user store. All right, so we're bringing that in. Also going to bring the use router in. So use router from view router. And then we need to initialize both of those. So let's say const use our user store. Set that to use user store. And then let's say const router. Set that to use router. And then for the logout, what we're going to do is if it first calls a logout function here, so we'll create that, and then from there we want to then take the user store and we want to call the logout action, and we can do that just simply by doing user store.logout. Then we just want to redirect, so router.push, and we want to redirect to the home page, the home view. Okay, so when we call that logout, it's going to clear the state, because again, in our user store, it's going to set the user ID and the name to null. So when we log in, we hit our backend, we get the data back, it sets it. When we log out, it clears it. So let's do it. Let's say log out, and now there we go. So now we want to do the chat, right? We want to be able to actually interact with the AI. So I'm going to log back in as John. So I should be able to just do john@gmail. We want to work on getting the messages, which right now John is a new account, so he doesn't have any. So I'm just going to add some. So I'm going to go to Postman, or open whatever HTTP client you want. Let's make a post request to chat, and then in the body, you want to include your user ID, which for me is going to be john_gmail_com. That should be lowercase ID. And then we want to send a message. And for the message, I'll just say, what is the capital of, let's say Maine. And let's send. Okay, so capital of Maine is Augusta. Let's send another message here. What do I want to ask it? Say what is the most popular programming language? Curious to see what it says. Most popular language is JavaScript. However, it may vary based on the specific industry or use case. Python and Java are also widely used. All right, so we have some chats now. So we want to get these, and we want those to display here. So what I'm going to do is create a new store for chats. So in stores, let's create a file called chat.ts. Now you can set your store up in different ways. In the user store, we use the object style, where we have a state, we have an object with state, actions, and just any other options. But we can also use the composition API, and we can use reactive variables with ref like we did in our components. So that's what I'm going to do with the chat store, because it's a little more complicated. So let's start off by importing define store. Okay, so we want to bring that in from Pinia. And then let's also import ref, because I'm going to be using reactive variables. That'll be from Vue. And then I'm going to bring in Axios, because I'm also going to do the fetch from here, or the HTTP request. And then let's do, what else? We also want the user store, okay, because we're going to need the user ID, the user that's logged in. So let's say use user store, bring that in from /user. All right, now we're going to be formatting our chat messages a certain way. So meaning the message that we send as well as the message we get back. And I'm going to use an interface for that. Okay, so this is a TypeScript interface, and it's basically just like a type where we define certain fields that it has to match. So let's call this chat message. And chat message has to have a message, which is going to be a string, and has to have a reply, which will be a string. So that's our chat message. Let's do another interface of formatted message. And formatted message is going to have a role, because when we get our messages back, we need to know which one is the user and which one is the AI. So the role is going to be a string of either user or AI. Okay, it has to be one of those. And then we'll have the content, which will be either the message or the reply. So that's going to be a string. So those are our interfaces. And you could put those in separate files if you want, but there's only 2 fields, so I'll just keep them here. And then let's export const, and let's say use chat store, just like we did use user store. Set that to our define store, which is going to take in the name, which we'll call chat, and then we'll have our function. Yeah, actually we don't want an object here. You can use an object like we did in the user store, but I'm going to have a function, and we can use the composition API here. So let's create a variable for messages and set that to ref. So it's going to be a reactive variable, and I'm going to use TypeScript generics here to define what a message should be, which is going to have a role, which will be a string, and content, which will be a string. And it's going to be an array messages, so we also want to have, after the curly brace here, our brackets, and ref is a function, so we want to have our parentheses, and the default value goes in here, which is an empty array. Okay, and then the other thing that I want to have is loading, and set that to ref, which is going to be false by default. Then we want to initialize our user store because we need that user ID. So let's say const user store, and set that to use user store, right? And then we need to have a function that will load previous chat messages. So let's say load previous chat messages, and we'll call this load chat history. And this is going to be asynchronous. Okay, and first thing I'm going to do here is check for the user ID. So we'll say if the user store dot user ID, or rather we want to say if not the user ID, then we just want to return. Okay, then we're going to open up a try catch, and we want to make our request, and the endpoint we're making the request to is get messages, right? Because we want to get our messages. So let's say const, and we're going to destructure the data from Axios. So let's say await Axios dot, and it's going to be a post request. And then we have our API URL, which is in the .env file. So let's use some backticks here, and we'll say to access that we can do import .meta.env, and then vt underscore API underscore URL. And then outside of the curly brace, we want to do slash get dash messages. Okay, so we're going to hit that endpoint. And then we want to pass in an object because we need to send the user ID with it to get the user's messages. So let's say user ID, and then user store dot user ID. All right, and then let's see. So the way that the messages come back, right? In fact, we can just check this out. So if I say new request, and I want to want post and then the get messages, and in the body I'm going to add my user ID, which is John underscore Gmail underscore com. If I do that, I get back my messages, the 2 that I just sent, right? So it comes back in an array called messages, and then an object that has ID, user ID, message, reply created at, where message is what I sent, reply is what the AI sent. Now I want to manipulate this data into basically into an array that has the role, which would be either the AI or the user, and the content, which will be either the message or the reply based on if it's the AI or the user, right? We want to match this right here. So this interface. So we have to basically map through and return an array with those two fields. And we also have to flatten it because what we can do by using map, right? If we map through, we can get like an array with the role, so it would be like user, and then content would be just whatever, right? And then we'd have another array like that, and we don't want that. We want an array that has objects in it like this. So we want to flatten it. So the method we can use to do that is called flat map, okay, which is just a JavaScript method. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to come down here and we're going to take messages, which is our reactive variable that we set up above, and I want to set the value of it, right? So value, and I want to set it to the data.messages, which comes back, which looks like this. Initially, it's going to look like this, an array of those objects. So on this, we want to run our flat map. I'm just going to go on the next line here. So let's say flat map, and then that takes in a function, and for this we're going to say MSG. So for each message, which is going to be formatted as the chat message interface, and then what that'll return, so right here we want to put a colon, and what that'll return is a formatted message array, okay, that matches this right here, the role and the content. Okay, so it gets passed in the chat message. We want it to return the formatted message, and the way we do that, actually we just want to set this right to an array and pass in an object and say role, so role user, and then the content will be the MSG dot and then message, because remember what we're getting back here. The message field is the user, what the user says. The reply is what the AI says. So we want to do that, and then let's copy that down, and then the role for AI will be the reply. So MSG dot reply. And then I want to just filter it because all I want is the content. That's what we want to show, right? Is the message and the replies, which is now going to be in content. We don't want to show the ruler, so the role, so I'm going to filter that out. So let's go on the next line and say filter and pass in, let's say MSG. So MSG, which will now be the formatted message. Okay, no brackets because it's not an array. We're going through each one, so each one will be a formatted message, and we just want to return from that. We want to filter out just the content, which will be the reply or the message. And then for the error, so in the catch here, let's just do a console.error, and we'll say error loading chat history, and then show the error. Okay, cool. So we have our chat store and we have our load chat history. So now we want to call this, right? We want to call this within our chat view. So let's go to chat view, and we want to bring in a couple things here. So up at the top, let's import. Now we want this to happen when the component mounts, and we can do that by using onMounted. So I'm going to bring in onMounted. I'm also going to bring in a function called nextTick, and what that does is it allows us to wait until the DOM finishes loading before it does something. So we're going to do that, and that's going to, both of those are going to be from Vue. And then we want to bring in both stores. So let's say use user store, and then we also want to import the use chat store. And while we're at it, let's bring in use router from Vue router. And I think that should do it for now. Now we need to initialize a couple things. So the user store, set that to use user store. Then we have the chat store, set that to use chat store. And then the router, so const router, set that to use router. And then I want to make sure that the user is logged in. So let's just say ensure user is logged in. And again, I know I've said this, but if you want to incorporate actual authentication with a password, you can do that. But I didn't really want to focus on authentication because that's, that's such a huge thing. I wanted to focus on the whole AI aspect of it. So yeah, let's just check if not. So if not user store dot user ID, then we're just going to take the router and we're going to push to slash. And then I also want to scroll to the bottom, right? So because we're going to be able to scroll through the chats, I want it to scroll to the bottom. So let's say auto scroll to bottom. So I'm going to create a function here called scroll to bottom. All right, and then in that, this is where we're going to use next tick, which again will wait until the DOM has been updated, and that takes in a function. And then to scroll to the bottom, let's get the chat container, which we haven't created yet. We don't have that, down in the output, but we will. So we'll say chat container, and we're going to set that to document.getElementById, and it's going to have an ID of chat dash container. Okay, so then under that, I'm going to just check for chat container, and then we'll take chat container and we're going to set the scroll top value to the scroll height. So chat container dot scroll height. Okay. Now, like I said, when the component mounts, right? We come to the page, the component mounts, that's when we want to call the load chat history that we just created in the store. So let's go under that scroll to bottom and let's say on mounted. Okay, so this is how we use this. We just pass in a function and then we're going to call chat store and then load chat history, which returns a promise. So I'll just use a dot then. And then we want to scroll to the bottom. So scroll to bottom like that. All right, and let's see, why is this does not exist on type store? Did I not save it? Oh, I didn't return this. Oh, so at the bottom here, we want to return an object, and we're going to return the messages, the is loading, the load chat history, and that's it for now. Okay, good. So now that error should go away. Now we want to add the output. So let's go right under the header, and I'll say chat messages. So we're going to have an ID of chat dash container, and let's add a couple classes here as well. So for classes, we're going to do flex dash one. Let's say overflow on the y-axis, auto. Let's do padding, so P4 and space dash y dash 4. Now, in here, we're going to have a div with a v4. So the v4 attribute will allow you to loop over something, in our case, the chat messages, and output elements based on, on those messages. So let's have, let's do a div. I'm just going to add a class of flex onto this, and then items dash start. Okay, so on this div, I'm going to add a v-4 directive and set that to, the way we do this is open up some parentheses and say MSG. So MSG, we can also get the index in, and then whatever we want to loop over, which is going to be the chat store dot messages. So we loop over those. We also need to add a unique key. So let's bind, so :key, and we're going to use the index as the key. And then let's see, we're going to have a conditional class, because if it's a user, I want to align it a certain way, and if it's a AI, I want to align it a certain way. So the way we do that is, in addition to class, we can do :class to make this dynamic, and then we can put basically a JavaScript expression in here. I'm going to say if the message.role, if that is equal to user, then I want to add the class of justify-end, else I want to add the class of justify-start. Okay, so that'll add some conditional styling. And then inside that div, we're going to have another div, and let's do a class of, we'll say max, let's do max with extra small, so XS, and I'm going to do padding on the x-axis 4, padding on the y 2, and let's do rounded large. And then I also just want to add on medium screens and up, then let's do a max width of medium. Okay, and then I want this to have a conditional class as well, because I want to have a different color based on if it's the user or the AI. So just like we did above, we're going to do :class for conditional styling. And let's say if the message.role is equal to user, then I'm going to have the class bg-blue-600 with text-white. Else, then I'm going to have the class of bg-gray-700 and text-white. And then let's put in here, we want the content, so msg.content, which will be either the reply if it's the AI's message, or message if it's the user's message. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, let's go ahead and try that. There we go. So it looks pretty good. What's the capital of main? Capital of main is Augusta. What's the most popular programming language? Gives us the answer. Cool. Now the next step is to be able to actually ask something, because right now we're just seeing the messages that are there. So let's go back to our chat store, and we're going to have a new function to do this. So let's see, we're going to go under this one, and let's say send new message to AI. And we're going to create a function called send message. Set that to async. And it's going to take in a message, which is going to be a string. Okay, then in our function, I'm going to check for, let's say, if, we'll say if not message, and I'm just going to add trim onto that to trim the white space, or not user store dot user ID, then we want to return. Okay, so if there's no message or if there's no user, then we just want to return. Then we're going to take our messages, right? So messages is our reactive value up here, right? So our messages, and I want to push on to that. So let's say messages.value.push. I want to add to that an array, not an array, an object with a role of user, because it's coming from the user. and then the content of message. Okay, and then this is where we're going to use that is loading. So I'm going to set is loading to true. Okay, because actually that needs to be is loading dot value. Set that to true because we're about to make our request. All right, so let's add a try catch, and in the try we're gonna make our request. So we'll destructure the data from await axios.post, and the endpoint we're hitting is the chat endpoint. So let's do our backticks, and then we're going to add the import.meta.env. We want the vt underscore API URL, and then slash chat. So that's the endpoint. And then we want to pass in the data that we want to send, which is going to be the message and the user ID, which is going to be set from the user store.user ID. Okay, now let's come down here and let's take the messages value and push onto that. And this time it's going to be the role of AI because this is the response, right? So role is going to be AI, and then content is going to be the data dot in the reply. Because again, it's going to look like, well, this is get messages, but when we send a chat, it's formatted the same way, basically. All right, so we do that, and then in the error, let's just return a message. We'll have a message, but it'll just say like unable to process. So let's take our messages and well, first off, you know what? Let's just console.error, and we'll say error sending message, and we'll put the error. Okay, and then as far as the messages go, let's say .value.push, and we're going to pass in an object with the role, which is going to be AI, and then the content, which will say error unable to process request. Okay, and we want to set the is loading to false, so for that we can add a finally, and then we'll set is loading, the dot value, set that to false. And then we want to make sure that we return the send message. Okay, so now we're ready to use that. So let's go back to our chat view, and let's see, we're going to go, so we get our message content, and we want to go under the second closing div here, and we're going to have a div. Let's do flex. So flex and justify dash start, and then this is going to have an if because I want to check for that loading state. So let's say vif and set that to chat store dot and then is loading. Okay, so if it's loading, then I just want it to say AI, the AI is thinking. So let's actually put a div with a background. We'll do gray 700 and text dash white px4 py2, and let's do rounded large. Okay, and then in that div we'll have a span, and I'm going to use the animate dash pulse class, and we'll say AI is thinking dot dot dot. Okay, so that's if it's loading. And then we want to put the input, the chat input, under, let's see, we got 1, 2, 3. So just above the last div is where I want to put the chat input. Now I want this to be in its own component. So let's do that. Let's create a new component in the components folder, and we'll call this chat input.view. Okay, and then we're going to add our script, and our setup and our lang of ts. Okay, and we're going to import ref from Vue, and I want to set a message variable here. So let's say const message, set that to ref. It's going to be empty by default. And then we have to send this up a level, right? Because we're embedding the chat input component into the chat view, and we need the message to be sent up. So we need to emit it. So we're going to say const emit. And the way we do this is we can use define emits. And then we're going to pass in an array, and it's going to be called send. Okay. Now here we want to have our send message and set that to an arrow function. Okay, and then that's what we're going to call when we submit the input. So before we do that, let's create our output, our template. So in our template, we'll have a class of padding 4. Let's do bg-gray 800 and flex. And then in that div, we're going to have our input, add a couple classes here, flex1, padding 2, rounded large, bg gray 700, text white, and then I want to have a focus class as well. So at the end here we'll say focus colon, and I just don't want to have an outline, so outline none. All right, and then in this input we're going to bind it to that message variable. So we use vModel for that. So vModel to message. And then we'll add a placeholder as well. So we'll say send a message. Make that lowercase. So send a message. And then I want to be able to call the send message function when we hit enter. We're going to have a button too, but I also want to be able to hit enter. So I'm going to add here, let's say at, and then we can do key up. And the key that I want is enter. So we can just say dot enter and then set that to send message. All right. And then underneath the input, I'm just going to put a slash there. So underneath the input, we'll have the button. So here, let's say button, and give it some classes. Margin left, we'll do margin left 2, px-4, py2. I'm going to do a color of BG blue 500 and rounded large. Okay, and the button will just say send. And of course, when we click this, we want it to call send message. So let's say at click, set that to send message. All right, and that should do it. Now we just have to add our send message here. And all we really need to do is emit the message up to the chat view. So let's first off check. We'll say if not message dot value, and then we'll just trim it. So if not message, then we want to return. Okay, and then we want to use that emit, and we want to emit send, and we want to send along with it the message dot value. And then we'll just clear the value. So message dot value, set that to an empty string. All right, now we need to embed the chat the chat input into the chat view. So let's import it. So right here we're going to import chat input, and we're going to come down here and go right above the last div, and let's embed it. So chat input. And then we want to pass here, we want to say at send, because remember, from the chat input, we emitted a custom event called send. So when that's called, basically when we hit the button or we hit enter, then that event is going to get called. So we need to add a handler to it, and the handler is simply going to be the chat store dot send message. Whoops. Chat store dot send message, and that's it. So now we have our input down at the bottom here. So let's try it out. We'll say who was the Who was the 10th president of the U.S.? So AI is thinking, and then it comes back, the 10th president was John Tyler. So, yeah, I mean, this is working. Now, one thing that I'd like to add, and we're going to have to do this in the back end, is context, because you'll see if I say now, we'll say what years was he president? Okay, so I'm going to send that. AI is thinking. To respond to your query, I need to know the specific person. So it doesn't have context, right? It doesn't know, it doesn't look back and see that I just asked about John Tyler. So we have to add that functionality in the back end. I'm actually going to go, let's see. So this is the back end here. I'm going to open up VS Code in the back end. Okay, so this is now my Express API. And we're going to go to the, let's see, the server TS. And where we want to do this is going to be the chat endpoint. And if you want to break these up into separate files, you can. I know that this is kind of a long file. But yeah, so this is the chat endpoint. And let me just figure out where I want to put this. So we check for the message, the user ID, we query users, check, make sure the user's there, check the user in the database. And let's see, then we set our response. So let's go after we check the user in the database and before we send the response. So we're going to go right here. And what we want to do is fetch users past messages for context. And what we want to do here is essentially, instead of sending back, because right now when we hit /chat, it sends back this. It sends an object with the role, the user role, and then whatever the message is. All right. I'm sorry, that's not what it sends back. That's what we're sending it. And then it sends back, down here, it sends back the reply. But what we want to do is, instead of us sending it only the current message, we want it to also have context of the last, whatever, 10, 20 messages, however many you want to set it. You want to input that into OpenAI as well as the current message. So that way it has context and it can look back. And when we say, what years did he serve, then they can look back at the last few messages and respond with that context. So to fetch the users, fetch the user's messages, we can come down to get messages. And right here, the chat history, we can just copy this block of code. Okay, and then we'll put that here. So right before we send the request to OpenAI, and we're just selecting from the chats where the user is the user ID. I'm going to get rid of this semicolon because I also want to just add order by. And we want to order by chats dot and then created at. And then I'm also going to limit it to the last 10 messages. If you want to put more, that's fine. But just remember, the more you put, the longer the request is going to take. All right, so we have that. Now, like I said, we need to send not just the current message, but the chat history. So what I'm going to do is create a variable for, actually, let's put a comment here. Let's say format the chat history for OpenAI. Okay, because it has to be formatted in a certain way. So I'm going to call this conversation, because that's what it is. A bunch of messages in context is a conversation. And for the type, we're going to use this chat completion message param. So we want to use that, and it's an array, so put some brackets on there. And I believe we have to bring that in. So up at the top, oh, it was brought in, okay. So this comes in from OpenAI /resources. All right, so back to where we were. So we're going to set that, and we're going to use flat map because it needs to be a flattened array. So let's say chat history, and then dot flat map, pass in our function, and say for each chat we want to return an array. So actually this can be just brackets. So we want to return an array that has, it should look like this, right? So it should have the role. So the user role will have the content of chat.message, and the AI role will have the chat reply. Because we need both. We need our messages and the AI's messages in the conversation in order to have context. So now let's go under that, and let's say, we'll put a comment here, and we'll say add latest user messages to the conversation. Okay, so we can do that by saying conversation.push, and we're going to push onto it the latest, which is this, right? Normally, or what we were doing is just passing this in. We still want to pass that in along with this stuff, so we're pushing this onto this. So we'll just put that in there like that. All right, now we should be able to come down here, and instead of, for messages, instead of doing this, we'll say conversation as, and then the chat completion message param array. Let's see, content. Oh, so this right here, this shouldn't be AI. This should be assistant. Because when you're dealing with OpenAI, there's a couple different types that you can use for role. There's user. We're dealing with assistant here. The AI is the assistant. So that should clear up that error. All right, so now that we've done that, it should have the context. We shouldn't have to change anything in the front end because it's still returning the same thing. You know, that's still returning the AI response, but it should have context now. So let's go ahead and run the back end because I stopped it. So I'm going to do npm run dev. All right, so now I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to say who was the 11th president of the U.S. Okay, James K. Polk. Now let's say, what years did he serve? There we go. James K. Polk served as the president March 4th in 1845, 1849. Cool. So now we have context. And I think that's something that's, really important. You don't want to just ask one question and that's it. You want to be able to conversate. All right, so we're just about done. There's one other thing I want to do. So let's say I was to do like, give me a list of the top 5 cities in the U.S. when it comes to crime rate. And you could take, I guess it could interpret that as lowest crime or best or, least crime. It answers, but it's not formatted very nicely. We have number 1 here, Albuquerque, number 2, Baton Rouge. So I want this to actually show in a nice list. So what we can do is just add a simple format message function in our chat view. So let's go to our chat view, and we can use regular expressions to replace certain tags and so on. So let's see, where do I want to put this? We'll put it right above the scroll to bottom, and let's say format AI messages for better display. So we'll call this format message, and that's going to take in text, which is going to be a string. Okay, and then we just want to check if there's no text. If there's no text, then we're just going to return an empty string. All right, and then we're going to return a bunch of replace methods with some regular expressions. And I'm not going to type this out. I'm going to paste it in, and you guys can get it from the repo if you don't want to type this stuff in. But basically, we're going to preserve line breaks. We're going to bold text. So we're looking for like new lines and replacing it with a line break, HTML tag, bold text, inline code, bullet points, etc. So the way that we use this is down here where we output the content. Instead of outputting it in the div inside of these curly braces, we're going to use the v-html directive on the div, right? So this div right here, let's add v-html, and then we can just set that to the format message function and then pass in our msg.content. And now, as you can see, the list is nice and clear. All right, so that's pretty much it, guys. If I were to log out and log in as, I think I have some messages with this, with, what was it, Brad at Gmail. And you can see the code when I asked for a REST API. I mean, it's not the best. If I make it a little bigger, you can see it better. It's not formatted the best, but it's readable, you know. But yeah, so that's it. We now have an AI chat bot that works pretty well and will give you, you know, GPT-4 powered data. Now, the last thing I'd like to do is actually deploy this. And since we have our backend and front end completely separate, we're going to be hosting our backend with Render, and we're going to host our front end with Vercel. All right, so let's get into that. All right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and deploy this project, and we have the backend, which we're going to be deploying to render.com, and the front end, which we'll deploy to Vercel. And both options have a great free tier, so you don't have to pay or enter any credit card information. This isn't sponsored by those companies. They're just services that I prefer, that I like to use. So we'll start with the back end. So Chat AI API, you need to make sure that you push both to GitHub. So this is the back end repo, this is the front end. All right, so I'm going to go to render.com, go to my dashboard. I'm just logged in with GitHub. And then we're going to click Add New Web Service, because this is an API. And then it should show all your GitHub repos. I'm going to choose Chat AI API. And then there's just some options that we need to add here. So for one, the build command, right? So if we look at our package.json, we're using TypeScript, and we need to compile that TypeScript. So we're going to do that on the server. So we need it to run this npm run build in addition to npm install. So right here, we're going to say and run npm run build. And then the other thing is the start. It's the server.js is going to be in the dist folder. So here, instead of node server.js, we're going to say node dist/server.js. All right, then we just have some environment variables. So in our .env, you can copy everything but the port. And then we can say add from .env, paste that in, add those variables. And that's it. Now we'll click deploy web service. And this can take like a minute or two. All right, so it says your build successful, your server is live. This is the domain here. And we can test this real quick. So I can go into Postman and make a new request, post request to this. Whoop, that's not it. It didn't copy. There we go. All right, so we want to do this domain, right? And then we're going to do slash, and let's do get dash messages. And then in the body, we're going to add user ID, and let's do John_Gmail_com and send. And there we go. So we're getting the messages. So we know that the API is now live. So now we want to do the front end. So I'm going to go to Vercel and log in with GitHub. Okay, and then we're going to click Add New Project. We're going to select Chat AI UI this time. And let's see. So Vite, build and output settings. I believe everything we can just leave as is. For environment variables, though, we want to add the Vite underscore API underscore key, not key. What am I doing? API underscore URL, right? Because this is going to be our endpoint, and we don't want to use localhost 8000 or whatever. We want to paste in the render endpoint or the render URL. And yeah, I think that's it. So let's click deploy. Again, this can take like a minute or two. All right, so that took like 10 seconds. And then we're going to continue. And let's check it out. If we just click on that, and you can see we're at the live site now. And I'm going to log in as, let's say, John, and John at Gmail. Start chat, and I should see my chats because remember, we're using the same database. And let's try it out. I'll say, what is the capital of Texas? AI is thinking. The capital of Texas is Austin. So we have this fully deployed, and you can see just how easy that was. All right, but that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. I may do another video where we create a React front end, or I might save it for my React course. I'm really not sure yet. And I may add on to this. We may add actual authentication with, protection of the actual messages and adding password authentication and so on. But I think that this is a really good start, and hopefully you guys learned quite a bit from this. And thanks for watching. If you liked it, leave a like, and I'll see you next time.